few months ago, Congresswoman Presley, one of the squad, or the Gang of Four as I like to call them, made a statement about, black people speaking with a black voice, brown people should speak with a brown voice, etc. And that's fine. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to speak not with a white voice, but I'm going to speak with an Italian voice. I'm going to speak with a Sicilian voice. And what I want to say is basically very simple. Leave Columbus Day alone. Don't touch Columbus Day. It's probably years ago. I was teaching U.S. history, and I was talking about the South and the New South after the American Civil War. And of course, I talked about racism, Jim Crow, segregation, and lynching. And I mentioned that over the period from the 1860s to the 1960s, well, figures varied. At least 4,000 African Americans, mostly men, were lynched. And usually when I would say that, people would be taken aback and just thinking about the number. But this one year, some white kid put his hand up and he said, were all the people lynched black? I said, no. There was about 3/4 of the people who were lynched in this country were black. Other people, whites were lynched, Asians were lynched, Hispanics were lynched, all kinds of people were lynched. But, blacks were less than 20% of the population, and they were 75% of the lynching. So I thought, okay, that would reinforce in his mind, the significance of what was happening. But then he asked another question. He said, well, what's that come out to a year? And I said, well, it's like about 40, somewhere between 40 and 50 people were lynched on an average year. And then he said something about traffic accidents. And I said, well, you can't compare the 40,000 people who die in traffic accidents. I mean, it's not like somebody stopped their car, pulled them out, and murdered them. I said, it's an accident by definition. You can't compare the two. This is apples and oranges. But after the class, I was thinking about his questions. And I thought, obviously, 4,000 doesn't throw them. I think it's attributed to Stalin, whether he said it or not, we don't know. But the quote is, the death of a single person is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. So I said, maybe I needed a better example or an additional example to throw into my lecture involving lynching. And I said, I wonder what the biggest mass lynching in U.S. history was. I mean, how many black people got strung up? And maybe I could drive that home. I could use that to illustrate a point that would hit them harder than just, 4,000 over a 100-year period did. So I decided to look it up. What was the largest mass lynching in U.S. history? So I typed it in. I don't know if I was using Google then or not, but you can use Google today. I double checked. You type in largest mass lynching U.S. history, you'll get the same results I got years ago. Largest mass lynching in U.S. history shocked me. It surprised me. Wasn't what I expected at all. It occurred in 1891 in New Orleans, Louisiana. 11 men had been charged with a crime. They'd been arrested. They'd been tried in New Orleans. They'd been found not guilty. And despite that jury verdict, a mob formed, broke into the jail, and strung up all 11 of them. I said, wow, 11, that's a lot. But that wasn't what surprised me. What surprised me was who they were. There were 11 Sicilians. Now, I'd gone 12 years Catholic school, grew up in Philadelphia. I am Sicilian, despite the name, the original name, the family name was Palermo. Changed to Palmer. And I didn't know anything about this. The biggest mass lynching in U.S. history involves Sicilians? I was shocked. These people who were lynched, the victims of this largest lynching in U.S. history, even had a name, the Linciati. I didn't know anything about it. And I read on, and I read some other things about the lynching, and it turned out in 1913, in the city where I live, Tampa, Florida, 2 Sicilians were lynched. That this wasn't all that unusual. And it made me think back to my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, John Palmer. One time I had asked him why we had changed the name, because the name had been Palermo. And he explained that they didn't really know what the family name was. Just like if you've seen The Godfather, Vito Andolini comes from Corleone, Italy. He comes to the United States. He lands in New York. They ask him where he's from, what town. He says Corleone. He becomes Vito Corleone. He loses the Andolini name. Well, that's what happened to my family. We don't know what they were named. They came from Palermo, Sicily. So he got the name. His name was probably Giovanni something or other. And he landed here. He became John Palmer, or John Palermo, excuse me. And I said, well, again, why did you change the name? And he said, well, wanted to pass for white. Now, at the time, I thought he's joking. But I don't think he was, because this is the period of this lynching, especially the 1913 lynchings. That's about when the family was changing the name. So if you were a Sicilian in this country, you were vulnerable. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing the Sicilian or Italian experience to the African American experience. But they weren't having a picnic. That's one of the reasons that my family changed its name. That's why I'm Mike Palmer and not Mike Palermo. I actually have a cousin's named Palermo. Now you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with Columbus Day? Interestingly enough, everything. Because of the lynchings, which occurred in 1891, and other problems that not just Sicilians, but Italian Americans in general are having, this had damaged relationships between the United States and the new unified state of Italy. Before that, Italy had been broken up into smaller states that we had always dealt with. But we'd always had a good relationship with the Italian states. One of the initial reasons the Americans went into the Mediterranean after the American Revolution was because of the Italian states. They weren't controlled by the major European mercantilist powers that would keep out American trade. So the Mediterranean was an area where we could still trade openly. We could trade with the Italian states, we could trade with the Ottoman Empire, which wasn't controlled by the European mercantilists either. And of course it was that projection of commercial power into the Mediterranean that led to our problems with the Barbary Corsairs, which is a whole other story I won't go into, and got us involved in the Tripolitan War, the war with Tripoli from 1801 to 1805 during the first administration of Thomas Jefferson, who was president then. The Italians had given us a lot of help. Initially, we based ourselves at Gibraltar, but that was too far from Tripoli. So we ended up under Commodore Preble operating out of Syracuse, Sicily. And they provided supplies, water, harbors, things like that, and even some manpower. Some of the small gunboats and things we bought were outfitted and crewed by Italians. In fact, one of the most daring acts of the age was when Commodore or Captain Stephen Decatur Jr. led this Intrepid, a ship, into Tripoli harbor to burn the American frigate Philadelphia, which had run aground and been captured by the Tripolitans. And he had to sail into the harbor at night in the dark without knowing where he was going. And he was assisted in that by a pilot. The pilot was a Sicilian. His name was Salvador Catalano. Family was probably originally from Catalonia, but they had settled in Sicily, which for a while was controlled by Spain. And Catalano spoke some Arabic, knew his way around the harbor, and he was the one who guided the Intrepid in to get alongside the Philadelphia, fending off inquiries about what you were doing in Arabic, which allowed Decatur and his men to get on board the Philadelphia, set it on fire, and then get back out in what Nelson called one of the most bold and daring acts of its age. And Catalano ended up coming back to the United States with Decatur, and the family settled in Washington, D.C. They mostly worked as employees of the Navy at the Navy Yard. So we'd had this long history. Actually, at one point, when the Pope was endangered, we actually considered the possibility of using the U.S. squadron in the Mediterranean to rescue the Pope. So we had a long history with the Italians. We had based ourselves in Syracuse, La Spezia, Livorno, and other places, and also in places in Spain and southern France. But we were in Italy and had interest there. And these interests had been damaged by the discrimination against and lynching of, this was a major event in 1891, 11 Sicilians. And Sicilians were being lynched in other places as well. In 1892, President Harrison decided to do something to placate the state of Italy, which was a big trading partner, to placate Italian Americans in general, and to sort of offset the damage caused the year before, in 1891, with the Linciati, the mass lynching of Sicilians in New Orleans. So what he decided to do to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus Day, 1492, 1892, was to declare in October Columbus Day as an American national holiday. So that's why Columbus Day is a national holiday. It was a response by the administration of Harrison to make up for the Linciati, the mass lynching of 11 Sicilians in New Orleans. And to do away with the holiday today, as some people, Democrats and some Republicans, are advocating, to do away with Columbus Day as a holiday would be an insult to the memory of Linciati, Sicilian Americans especially, and all Italian Americans. It's just not some day they picked out because they liked Columbus and they liked the discovery of America. This was a day that was set aside in response to the largest mass lynching in American history that had happened just the year before. That's why we have Columbus Day. And that's why it would be disgraceful to get rid of it. So, that's my Italian voice. That's my Sicilian voice. Leave Columbus Day alone. Just leave it alone. Don't go there. I understand about Juneteenth. You want to make that a holiday? I have no problem with that. I'm always for more federal holidays. But leave Columbus Day alone. Columbus statues, different story, maybe a different video. But for Columbus Day, don't touch it. It's not about Columbus. It's about Italian Americans. It's about Sicilian Americans. It's about the largest mass lynching in U.S. history. And the people who strung out on the ends of those ropes weren't black. They were Sicilian. They were just like me. And I don't want that memory lost. Hopefully you got something out of this video. I mean, I've been teaching 40 years. I've been talking about informing students about the Linciati for at least 25 years. And in all of the students I've taught, and it's over 1,000, I've never had a single student who knew anything about it. They were totally taken aback by the idea that the largest mass lynching in U.S. history involved Italian Americans, involved Sicilians. So if you did get something out of this video, you liked it, please leave a comment, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button so you'll know when I post new videos, and until the next time, I am out of here.